So if you can take your seats, we're almost ready to start. So well done to the catering staff here who have managed to get all of us fed in just 45 minutes. I'm always very impressed with how they do that. Hopefully you enjoyed your lunch and you've caught up with some more interesting and new people. For our afternoon session, we're going to start to think about issues other than carbon as well as carbon. And our next speaker is Chris Bridgman, MBE. Chris is a specialist in the design, installation and maintenance of living green roofs on new and existing structures. He's managing partner of Bridgman and Bridgman LLP, vice chair of the Green Roof Organisation and UK representative of the European Federation of Green Roof and Wall Association, and then UK representative and founder of World Green Roof Day. Chris will be presenting an overview of the key considerations in the retrofit of green roofs, and he'll be discussing some case studies from Bridgman and Bridgman's retrofit projects, offering insights into the practical challenges and opportunities of enhancing biodiversity and integrating biophilic design into existing buildings. So please welcome Chris.
Thank you, Siobhan. So I'm sure you'll agree that was a fantastic lunch put on for us all here, and how welcoming everyone's been from the university. It's my third time here talking about green roofs, and just before I start, I just wanted to congratulate the people in the university and yourselves for the incredible work that's going on here in terms of sustainability. There's a really good team pushing some really good agendas, and I'm sure that work will continue. And yeah, just to congratulate you all before we start. So this afternoon's topic is, I'm going to talk to you about green roofs. And as Siobhan kindly introduced me, I am the partner of Bridgman and Bridgman. It's not a law firm, it is a green roof installation company. And we work all over the UK bringing rooftops to life. My career and background is horticulture, so I actually started planting trees and shrubs on the ground, and then back in 2009 we were asked to do a green roof project as part of a landscape project on the University of Brighton. And in business, I was never one to say no, and I said, yeah, absolutely, we'll do it. I didn't know what a green roof was. And I've never looked back, and actually that was a real turning point for me, because I actually felt that not many people respected what we did on the ground. We were just the trees, the green bit at the end of a construction phase. And actually when we started to put greenery on rooftops, it felt like people were interested. You know, we were having carpenters, plumbers, flooring experts start saying, what are you doing up on the roof? Why are you putting plants up there? And when you explain to them the benefits of putting green roofs on, they suddenly question, why isn't every roof green? Which continues to be my question. That's our campaign. I went on to become Vice Chair of the Green Roof Association, which is GROW. That's worth you noting, GROW, because they produce the code of good practice for green roofs across the UK, including fire guidance, minimum standards, and it's just a really good, free, accessible tool to help you in the design, planning and maintenance of green roofs. I did also found World Green Roof Day, which is on the 6th of June every year, and I'm looking forward to you all celebrating and seeing Belfast on the map when that comes around. And it's important to note that actually this isn't just local. Globally, green roofing is a big thing, and actually we're one of the smallest markets in the world. So there's lots of scope and potential here for us to move on. I've come from a city, a new city called Milton Keynes, and I thought, oh, probably few people will have heard of it or even been there. And then Hannah, who's the next speaker after me, in conversation with her, it turns out that we grew up on the same street in the same town in the same part of Milton Keynes. So it's not as small as I thought, but You probably know of it, of roundabouts and concrete cows, but actually there's a lot of green space. In fact, we've got 24 million trees in our new city, and however, we've got a lot, as you can see behind me, a lot of flat roof space that could become green. In fact, in 2019, when we mapped the city centre, there's the equivalent of 6 full-size football pitches worth of space that could be greened overnight without structural enhancement. Now, that's a lot of green space when we're in a climate emergency and we need more green space. The challenge we have is bringing people on board and financing it. So when we talk about living roofs, it is vegetation above a watertight roof surface. So if you can imagine a garden shed or a garage with a felt roof on it, that felt would still need to be there, but we're going to add some layers above it to create a green living roof. And that's really important because you still want the building to be watertight. Some people fear that a green roof is going to be ivy roots coming through their living room if it's on top of their house, which it's not. It is an additional layer to a surface that already exists. And it doesn't have to be big roofs, so anyone can feed into this. Anyone may resonate with some of the pictures behind that. Actually, it could be a boot store, it could be a bus stop, it could be a shed, it could be a kitchen extension, or it could be a huge factory. The possibilities are endless, but note there as well, there's some pitch roofs and shaped roofs as well, which is doable, but it's worth noting that if you are putting green roofs on a pitch or a slope, then it's likely you're going to need to irrigate that, which could be going a little bit against what the benefits of a green roof is. But all the same, there's some very visual images there that hopefully will spark your imagination. A very quick history lesson. Green roofs are not a new thing. The first ever depicted green roofs were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. We then look at medieval Europe. That's when they were using sods from the footprint of a building, putting it on the roof, and obviously using that as a good tool for insulating the building. I'll go on, but actually a key one to pick up here is the 1880s. In Berlin, they found that during the hot summers, the asphalt started to melt. So what they did there was put a sand layer on the roof to protect the asphalt from melting. And over time, that became vegetated. So it was a little bit of a rebirth of green roofs there. America, the Rockefeller Center, 1920s, money was no object. There's still a lot of green roofing, roof gardens installed in America and Canada. And then Germany, 1960s, an energy crisis similar to what we're in now. Germany looked to see how they could reduce bills and improve the efficiency of their buildings. And again, green roofs came back to be part of that solution. London, we've got over 1.5 million square metres of green roof, which sounds a lot. It's actually not a lot, and there's lots more potential. Going back to, similar to Milton Keynes, 30% of London is roof space that could be retrofitted without structural enhancement. So again, that's a lot of green space that we could create, especially as in London we're paving over the equivalent of 2 Hyde Parks every year. So where's the green space going and how are we recreating that? So again, we look to the roofs for that solution. You may have heard of a green roof guru called Dusty Gedge. He's still a really big figure in the industry. We owe a lot of the success of green roofs in the UK to him. He went to Switzerland 20-odd years ago as a wildlife photographer, saw that they were big on green roofs and roof gardens, and actually came back and started his campaign to bring this into London, which he's done. He's done well. But then there's been a few rocky roads along the way. When he first came back, he introduced them as brown roofs, and actually it was about putting all the waste from the building site or or the construction site up onto the roof, which he thought was a good idea at the time. It soon went on to, he realised, and often admits now that that wasn't a good idea. And the reason for that is we don't know what's in the material that's just won off of site, and we also don't know how much that's going to weigh when it's fully saturated. So part of this process, there's a lot of structural engineers to keep happy, and I'll refer to my colleagues in the front row, but it's really important that we know the weight of the green roof when it is at its heaviest from a safety point of view, and that's why we do have to use a certain amount of engineered materials to create them in the current climate. Benefits of green roofs, so they're not 100% of the solution to any one problem, but they are 50% of the solution to lots of different problems. Biodiversity is a big driver. Rainwater, flood reduction in our towns and cities. We can keep the water up at roof level for longer. We can slow down that flow. We can clean the air. We can capture carbon. We can actually prolong the roof life. So going back to Berlin, where they were protecting the roof from the sun and the rain breaking down the roof membrane, we can actually prolong the roof life by up to 3 times by doing that. So there are a lot of people and misconceptions and arguments about why they're not a good idea, but I don't think any of those arguments really stack up when we look at the benefits of green roofs. And often the arguments are a green roof will cause leaks. It won't, or it shouldn't do if it's installed correctly. The leak is probably going to be there before the green roof went on. What was probably missing is a leak test to detect if there were any leaks before it was buried. But we can also look at roofs for different uses, so people and nature, food production, also mental health and well-being. If you're in a town and city and you're looking out onto lots of dull, grey, flat roofs, actually to look at green and see nature is going to help with our mental health and well-being. So, as you can see, lots of different benefits and lots of ways that green roofs can actually improve our towns, cities, and even smaller rooftops as well. Now, a common type of green roof is the extensive, what they call extensive sedum roof. This is what we call our entry-level green roof. Lots of this has gone on around the UK, Northern Ireland and Ireland, but actually we have to keep in mind that this is our entry-level green roof. And what Queens are really good at doing is actually saying, we want to better this. We don't just want the bare minimum, we want green roofs to be performing the best they can, and actually the design of our green roofs to be thought out and planned in from the very beginning. And sedum is good, but it isn't great, or it's not as good as wildflowers are and biodiverse roofs are for pollinators. So keep in mind, this is our entry-level green roof. The other extreme is what we call intensive green roofs or roof gardens. So this is actually recreating what you might see on the ground up on roof level. So trees, shrubs, lawns, food growing plots. And this is IKEA's store in Greenwich that we worked on back in 2019. It achieved BREEAM Outstanding and is probably one of only a handful of retail buildings that have ever achieved that in the world. IKEA were very clever. They built a store where actually they could build a bigger store because their green space was up on the roof. So commercially, it makes a lot of sense because they've now got a bigger store. But this rooftop is open to people visiting the shop. So if you're a customer, if you're a co-worker, there's a rooftop pavilion up there, so you can go up there and eat meatballs on the roof terrace. You can do yoga on a Wednesday. And actually, the biggest success of that roof, we felt, was the co-workers actually really embracing food growing. And annually, there's always a fight for the strawberries because they grow so well up on the roof. And I think that's really actually created something good amongst the staff there. So that's you've got the extensive and you've got the intensive, but we're actually looking probably realistically somewhere in the middle, because to build an intensive green roof or roof garden, you've got to have a pretty strong structure to take that weight. Now, there was a league table done, and this represents cities outside of London with the most amount of green roofs. You'll see that Belfast was number 21, and this was back in 2023 that this was released, which is really good. I think 21 is a good position to be in. And actually, the most amount of roofs in Belfast are extensive, so they are our basic sedum type roof. This is a report done by Gentian, that are a mapping company that look at how green our cities are and can produce a lot of data from that. But what is really interesting on this graph is that Belfast is actually number 4 for the most amount of bio-solar green roofs. Now, I haven't told you about that yet, but we will go on to that. But again, something to be celebrated here in Belfast, that you are number 4. And this is what a bio-solar roof is. So a lot of people often think there's competition between green roofs and solar panels. There doesn't need to be. A bio-solar roof is a combination of the two. So this is a children's hospice in Barnet, in London. And actually, it's the green roof weighing down all the bases and framework to hold the PV panels. So there's no penetration needed into the roof deck to support the panels, which is good from a leak risk point of view. But actually, some really good points about the solar and green roof together is actually the green is cooling the air temperature. So it's reducing the temperature by 3 degrees, and that means the solar panels are actually performing better because the air is cooler. And what's nice as well is actually the water from rain and condensation is being directed down to irrigate the green roof. So they go hand in hand, and they're actually really beneficial together. And the Department of Education has now said that every new school in the UK under their remit will have a bio-solar roof going forward. So it's a big drive in the market. It's a big directional change, but also a good argument that you don't need one or the other. You can actually have both. This is the YMCA in Milton Keynes. So this was a project that we were actually invited on a site tour when it was in construction, and the YMCA said we'd really love a green roof, a roof garden, but actually we need the funds to go towards creating the right accommodation for our young people, and actually we don't have the budget. And what we said is if we can ever raise the money to do it, we will retrofit a green roof, which is what we did. And it's a really great space that they use. It's been a really good tool for actually raising awareness of green roofs in our city and getting people onto that roof to look down onto theirs and actually think, well, we can do the same. And it's created that drive. But what's really nice is that the residents use this as their own space. It's their own unique space. They grow fruit and veg on the roof, and they sell it downstairs in their social enterprise cafe. So it doesn't just have to be nature. What we really need to be looking at is creating spaces for both people and nature, and utilising roof space where we can. This is actually a project down in Swansea that we're working on in Wales. And if anyone's heard of the Bosco Verticale in Italy, which is all green facade, it's trees on balconies, this is the equivalent, or the planned equivalent, in Swansea. It's called biophilic living. It's renovating an old shop that was Woolworths on the high street, and it's actually by Pobble Housing Group, so it's social housing. They've put 7 stories on top, and they've retrofitted the existing building, and this is what it's going to look like. So I'm sure you'll agree that's quite ambitious for a social housing scheme to create something so green. I think it's a really good scheme. What you'll see there is there's green roofs, green walls, There's glass houses that span 3 levels. There's lots of food growing plots as well for residents to grow their own fruit and veg and actually have their own green space. And each property will have their own balcony with planting on that. Now, this can go 2 ways. It is a great scheme, the design is a great scheme, but the really important part of this is getting buy-in from the people that are going to live in it. And actually, Pobble are going to interview everyone that's on the waiting list to move in to make sure that they understand that they need to be part of this journey to build it. As a contractor, that's a really nice scheme for us to just go down to Wales and build, but actually, where's the benefit in that? Where's the benefit in us travelling from Milton Keynes to go and green a rooftop in Wales for a community? So we've turned this on its head as well. We will be present on site, but actually we're going to train and upskill local tradespeople, gardeners, residents that are going to move into the building, and anyone that wants to be part of this movement to actually be part of this journey. And that's much more important. And as we said earlier, as it was mentioned on the panels about skills shortages, this is the only way we're going to change that, by actually creating real life opportunities for people to be part of. So that's really exciting, and but it will have its challenges. Speaking with the developer that's building this, they have said that they would never have been able to achieve this if it wasn't for the Welsh Government funding it. So that shows that actually people want to do good things, but where's the money behind it to fund that? And Welsh Government have had the foresight to put a lot of money aside to help with schemes like this. But that is the reality, that actually this is not cheap to do, and what is the return on investment for those developers, especially in the climate they're in. So this was planned and in development way before material prices shot up, and lots of other global issues that we've got that have meant that actually this is costing a lot more than it was ever going to. But they've got to carry on with the greening scheme, and they really want to carry on with that greening scheme. But traditionally, if you come to the end of a build and you're running out of money, this is often the thing that's value engineered. It was green to start with, but it's not going to be green anymore. So this is it's going to be interesting, and it's well worth watching as to how this will develop. I think it will work, but it's not going to be an easy road. So I wanted to make it more relevant to you here, and actually I did quite a quick search of Google Earth and found a couple of buildings in the city centre that I thought are prime for green roof retrofit. If anyone here is from the Education Authority in Belfast, then this is a free consultation for you, so enjoy it. But actually I picked these roofs because, as you can see, especially the Education Authority on the right is currently finished with paving slabs. And when we map towns and cities and look for retrofit opportunities, we know that an extensive green roof is going to weigh roughly the same as a paved or pebble finished roof. So one option is we can take the paving slabs off of this roof and retrofit with a green roof. And it's a really nice building. It's got edge protection there, which is a big hurdle for us. It's a big hurdle for anyone retrofitting the safety of people on rooftops. That building is around 1,342 square metres, so keep that in mind for when we move on to cost considerations. So if we were to retrofit that building, we would need the assistance of engineers. We need to know that that roof can take the additional weight of a green roof. We need to leak test it as well. We need to make sure that there are no current leaks, or if we're going to replace the waterproofing, that we do it at this time. Edge protection, safety. How are we going to construct the roof safely? How are people going to access it safely to maintain it going forward? That is a huge part of this process, and a big consideration. And then we move on to things like protecting the roof with various green roof layers. Substrate. Now, I mentioned earlier we can't just put any old topsoil up on the roof because we don't know its weight capacity, so we do actually use an engineered substrate, a growing medium that we know is lightweight, it's free draining. We also know that its properties in terms of fire. If it was to ever catch fire, we know that there is a low organic content within that, so it wouldn't burn, it would smoulder, but it actually falls in line with fire regulations, which is a big topic right now. Vegetation, as I said earlier, wildflowers, habitat mosaics are really important for attracting biodiversity and species rather than, so we want different types of birds, bees and butterflies. We don't just want the basic vegetation like sedum. We want to be ambitious with our projects and create and attract wildlife back up to our roof spaces. A cost consideration also, well, the biggest ones are the delivery of it, the labour and overheads, and how we're going to get the stuff up to roof level. So do we need cranes in there to lift materials up? Do we need to close roads to actually build it as well? So this is all things that we need to consider when we're thinking about retrofitting a green roof. And just as a rule of thumb, based on all of those things, taking all those into consideration, we're probably looking at around £85 to £100 a square metre to retrofit that green space. So some people will think that's a lot of money, some will think that's quite reasonable, and actually for what we will achieve by doing it, all those benefits, I think that's actually quite a reasonable price. If we compare those to green walls, we saw some green wall slides earlier in the day. The cost of a green wall is around £500 to £700 a square metre, so that's quite a big difference between green roofs and green walls. Also, maintenance is a lot cheaper on a green roof. It's around 2 or 3 maintenance visits a year. A green wall is going to need a lot of intervention. After a number of years, you're likely to have to replace most of that vegetation because it's such small root zones that the plants are growing into. These green roofs should actually last as long as the building and won't need that continued replanting program or continued irrigation like a green wall will. So my top tips, if you're going to do a green roof, if it's something small in your domestic environment, if it's part of the university, if it's a shed, if it's a student accommodation block, a new building, then the key top tips are the structural assessment, making sure it's strong enough, but actually working and finding out how much a good green roof is going to weigh, and actually work with your engineer to make sure that's designed in. Don't just go for the basic, let's aim higher. Ensuring the waterproof is watertight is a really big thing, because once you bury that and there's a leak, it's going to be hard to ever get back to finding where that leak is, plus the cost of lifting it all up again. So for the cost of £500 to £1,000, leak testing a roof is a no-brainer. And then substrate depth, that's your growing medium. That's the key and the real success to a good green roof. As much as you can within the weight constraints of a building, get that substrate on, because that's how it's going to be the most sustainable for you. And then just remember that green roofs are low maintenance, not no maintenance, which is a very common misconception. So there we go. You can follow Bridgman and Bridgman or the Green Roof Project in Milton Keynes, which is on a campaign to bring our rooftops to life, or get in touch with any questions. As I said earlier, Green Roof Organisation, the Grow Code, it's free to download. That's a really good resource for anyone embarking on a green roof journey going forward. So, thank you.
So thank you very much to Chris. Really interesting to see how green roofs can be implemented across buildings, retrofitting. I'm wondering maybe if I need to talk to you about the flat roof out the back of my house. But yeah, definitely very interesting to see that, and to see regenerative approaches as well, where you're upskilling local communities so they can bring that into their own workforce. So our final speaker today is Hannah Dixon. Hannah is a chartered architect, certified passive house designer, an AECB certifier, and founder of Progress in Practice, an architectural studio specialising in sustainable, low-carbon construction and community engagement. She has a wide variety of experience working on passive house and low-energy schemes as both project architect and passive house consultant, ranging from multi-million pound net zero energy passive plus schools to AECB certified bungalows and community-led leisure centre refurbishments. Progress in Practice have, in their first 3 years of existence, delivered the first Passive House Plus project in the northwest of England, the first 2 AECB carbon light retrofits in Greater Manchester, and are working with Carbon Co-op on scaling up retrofit through innovative area-based funding models. Please welcome Hannah to the floor.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Siobhan. And thanks to the whole team who have put on just an amazing event here today. I'm just going to plug in quickly. So I'm here with 2 hats on today. One as Progress in Practice, so as an architect and a passive house designer, but also in my role as a trustee on the board of trustees, for the AECB, which is the Association of Environmentally Conscious Building, which is an organisation which focuses on delivering sustainable construction. And it's actually the organisation that brought Passive House to the UK. So it's been around for about 30 years, and it's really what's the word? Put it this way: have you heard of Passive House? Can you put your hand up if you've heard of Passive House? So that's, I think, 100%-ish. Could you put your hand up if you've heard of the AECB? So that's all right, but it's definitely significantly less. So as a kind of way of introducing the AECB, I'd like to talk a bit about the standards. I won't talk so much about the training, but they've got this amazing resource, an amazing network as well, that I'd really encourage people to kind of look into and get involved with. So like I say, I'd like to maybe just go back to basics. I know I'm the final speaker of the day, so you're probably not expecting to be asked what is a retrofit at this point. But I think it's a good question, and I think probably there's a variety of different answers across the room and maybe amongst the speakers, and I'm happy to have a little fisticuffs at the end of it, or you can heckle me if you like. But as far as I'm concerned, what a retrofit means as opposed to a refurbishment is that we're minimising energy demand through fabric efficiencies. Minimising energy demand through fabric efficiencies with a whole house retrofit plan. The idea of having a whole house plan is part of, it's built into the PAS 2035 framework. So if you were working on SHDF schemes, you would be following this kind of process anyway. But actually it's best practice, even if you're working on very small domestic projects, because it sets out a pathway for achieving a deep whole house retrofit, even if you're not able to do all of that stuff right at the beginning. You can phase it out. And you can do that without locking in poor performance. Generally, from our perspective, it means modelling the building in PHPP, which is the Passive House Planning Package. It doesn't mean that you're going to be hitting the Passive House target, but it means you know what it is that you're aiming for at the end of the project. So whether it's phased or not, it makes sense to get those targets in place right at the beginning. You might be aiming for the Passive House Benefit Standard, or you might be aiming for the AECB Carbon Light Retrofit Standards, or you might be using the LETI or the RBA standards to just guide your path and your kind of targets. But really, there are factors that kind of apply to everything, which are addressed in the same set of measures. So in any case, we'll always be looking at these 5 measures, and it seems really obvious, but it's worth repeating. You need to insulate everything, not just the walls, not just the loft but literally every part of your building. So we'll be talking about the walls, the roof, and the floor as well, which is a particularly challenging area. And we want to have absolutely no gaps in that insulation. So where your windows join your walls, you need to make sure that's joined up. Same about where your floor meets your walls. We also need to have absolutely no thermal bridges. That's impossible in a retrofit, pretty much. So we need to then start to think about how we mitigate thermal bridges. Thermal bridges is where the structure generally passes through your insulation layer. So it's just about working out those really awkward details. We want a really excellent standard of airtightness. I've been educated about airtightness in Northern Ireland recently, yesterday, in fact. In England, we have terrible airtightness. We have a target of 5 meters cubed per meter squared. Apparently, you have it worse. You have 10, is that right? So when we're aiming for a retrofit, we want to get that as low as we possibly can, and that can contribute as much nearly as the insulation on the building. So it could be about 30% of your space heating demand reduction could be through making your building very, very airtight. And that's generally, well, there's a million different ways of achieving that. For the ACB retrofit standards, the target is 2 air changes. For the NFIT standard, it's 1, so it's really significantly reduced. And then in terms of windows, we want to get as high quality windows as we possibly can. Generally, we like those to be triple glazed. If you put in the best possible windows that your money can buy, your windows will still be the worst part of your building. They contribute to the comfort of your building. So if you sit next to a window and you can feel the cold coming off of it, that affects your experience of the building and the comfort that you experience through sitting in a building. So if you go for a very high-spec triple glazed window, that actually addresses that. It also reduces the amount of drafts that you'll get due to convection within the building. So it's worth investing in. And then finally, there should be no retrofit without ventilation. There's quite a wide range of different options for ventilation. You can go for the Rolls-Royce, the MVHR, the mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, because once you've done all of these things, once you've made a lovely airtight insulated building, the last thing you want to do is stick holes in your windows or in your walls and let uncontrolled cold air come into your building. So the ideal is MVHR, but there are other options as well. So you can go for demand-controlled ventilation, for example. And that's the basics. So if you do all of those things to a really high standard, the chances are that you will minimize your energy demand and that you could get to a certifiable level, I guess the question might be why retrofit? Wrong. There you go, why retrofit? So the big 3 are obviously carbon, as we've talked about quite a lot today. But the other 2 are actually, they're really significant in terms of our experiences of the buildings, but also they're really good selling points. So if you're trying to convince a client or a customer that they should be going to the extra mile and going to the next level in terms of retrofit, really emphasising the level of comfort that you can achieve through a properly retrofitted certified building and the impact on people's health can be a real selling point. We obviously know that we're in a climate crisis. We know that we need to minimise carbon emissions, but the issues go much, much deeper than this. Our building stocks, our housing stock in particular, they're centuries old, decades old maybe, but it's not created for this point in time, basically. We've got drafty buildings, we've got damp buildings, we've got roofs that are failing. So we've got a whole set of maintenance measures that need to be done anyway. And whilst at this point in time, we know, in this room probably, we have the skills to be able to build a very, very low energy, very comfortable building. Our housing is not up to that standard. It's last century's housing, so we need to do something about it, regardless of regardless of carbon. But, you know, it's as good a reason as any. So this is a genuine news article from the BBC, the Northern Ireland BBC, which kind of drills home this requirement to retrofit. We're in 2025, and we have news articles which talk about the physical and the emotional, you know, mental impact of energy price rises. We've got a housing stock that's not meeting our requirements, and yet, and this is pinched from Rachel Owens from the National Retrofit Hub, but there was a Which survey conducted, I think, in 2023, where they found that 46% of people living in the UK believe that their homes do not require upgrading in terms of insulation and energy. So actually, we don't know what we're missing. We don't realise that we need to retrofit. So there's quite a big question about how you reach those people. So if you know you need to retrofit, and you know what a retrofit is, why certify? So certification is our only tried and tested tool for ensuring that we 100% eliminate the performance gap. If we don't certify, there is a risk of delivering buildings like this. Now, this is quite a famous, you might have heard of it. It's a project in Preston, in the north of England, where there has been more money spent on the remediation work following a very poor retrofit because of the mistakes that you can see on here. So we've got thermal bridging, we've got poor installation of insulation, we've got damp literally dripping down the walls of a retrofit. And the reason that we want to go down the route of certification is to make sure that we build in quality assurance. And if anyone is ever thinking about doing a large-scale retrofit, you need to look at that project first to fully understand what the risks of a poor retrofit are. So obviously I've mentioned the performance gap. I don't know how familiar people are with this concept, but in the UK, research shows that the average performance gap is 60%, which means that if you commission a new building, the chances are the performance of that building is going to be roughly 60% worse than what you paid for and what you've designed. That's the average. That can go up to as much as 200%, as we've got shown on this graph here. So in reality, there are two issues with that. One is that we're not hitting our energy demand targets. And the other is that if you're delivering a building that is that poor in quality, that's missing the targets so badly, you are building in risks in terms of those, the thermal bridging, the moisture risks in retrofit. These are figures for new build. I'm not sure of the data for retrofit. I'm assuming it's probably much worse. I think there's 2.17 million retrofits that have been carried out in the UK. 2.1 of them are by Eco. Of that, 35% were boiler upgrades, which means that probably the rest of those are loft insulation and, I'm guessing, maybe insulated plasterboard, dot and dab insulated plasterboard. And if you don't know what's wrong with insulated dot and dab plasterboard, then definitely talk to me after this, and I'll run you through it. So once you've decided to go down the route of certification, there's a big question about how far do you take it? How do you pitch it just right? And the certification standards we have available to us, we have the Passive House and the Passive House Benefit standards at one end. That's a very, very high performance building, extremely comfortable, and very, very healthy in terms of its indoor air quality. And at the other end, we have building regs. The ACB recognised that the methodology behind Passive House is great. It's a very, very rigorous process of modelling, of detailed design, and of quality assurance on site that means that you eliminate the performance gap. But it also recognises that that's not really achievable on every single project. So the ACB carbon light standards are supposed to be the standards that are basically practically achievable on nearly every project, most projects, let's say. I say that because obviously there are listed buildings and conservation areas where it becomes much more challenging and difficult to reach that standard. But these standards are measured using space heating demand. And the space heating demand is it's a metric that we should all know. So it's like, it should be as familiar to us as miles per gallon. You know, it's that kind of, it should be that ubiquitous. And when we're talking about the energy efficiency of a building, if we're not talking about space heating demand, what really are we talking about? So it's the amount of energy that you use to heat a metre square of your building per year. So it gives us a kind of a language that describes the efficiency, and it means we're able to compare apples with apples, I guess. So again, the ACB Carbon Light retrofit standard is practically achievable for most buildings. So coming back to process and how we build in that quality, whether you're aiming for Passive House or whether you're aiming for the ACB standard, it's pretty much the same thing in terms of process. So we start off the project by getting to know the building as much as possible. We get as many surveys as possible, relevant surveys. We manage risk. We do moisture risk assessments. We work out the condition of the existing building so that we don't get surprises later, but also so that we can tailor any retrofit measures that we propose to the appropriate measures to that building. So, for example, you'll have a different approach if you're dealing with a 1960s cavity wall construction compared with solid masonry. So any good retrofit should start with a retrofit assessment. The next stage of the process is to design your strategy, so your retrofit strategy. That will include, it should include modelling your building in PHPP. So you can't really know what your building can achieve without modelling it in PHPP. You can have a good guess. You can look at the geometry. You can work out from the orientation, the design of the glazing, roughly what the kind of biggest challenges are going to be. But unless you've modelled it in PHPP, you won't know what's the most achievable. And really, there'll be situations where you've modelled it and you're hoping to get to the Passive House standard, but to get to that standard, you need 300, 400 mil of insulation, and that's just never going to be viable. Whereas you might find that you just have the perfect scenario. And like I say, it all depends on the form, the orientation, whether it's detached or it's a terrace building. But that'll come out in that process, that kind of PHPP and the feasibility of the retrofit strategy. The next stage, and this is obviously a very, very simplified version of the process, but you will need proper detailed design. You'll need to work out how to do your airtightness around your windows, and you'll need to communicate that in a super detailed package of information, because achieving an airtightness of 2 or 1 is really, really hard. It's not something that can be left to chance. It needs to be designed in at every point in the building's fabric. And then finally, quality assurance on site. So in order to certify a project, what we need to do is to prove that we've built it the way that we've said we were going to build it in our detailed design. So if this is a Passive House project, what you'll be doing is you'll be documenting the building on site. You'll be taking photographs of the delivery notes, of the packaging of the installation. You'll be compiling all of that, and you'll be putting in a package to go to your Passive House certifier. That then gets sent across to Germany and gets verified independently. So you have 2 steps of independent verification. If you go for an ACB standard building, it's the same sort of process. So you still need to prove that you've done what you said you were going to do. And again, that just comes through photographs mostly. but also doing pressure tests throughout the build. So you'll need to prove that you've got the airtightness you said you were going to get. Generally, it's recommended that you do 3 pressure tests throughout the build just to make sure you don't have one big bad surprise at the end of the project. But again, all of this information, the commissioning of your ventilation, all of that goes into one package. And if it's an AECB project, you can work with an AECB certifier who self-certifies that. So it's a slightly less drawn-out process. It's supposed to be slightly more affordable. And it should be simpler in theory. It's the same level of verification, though, or quality assurance, let's say. And some examples of carbon light projects. This is obviously not my project, and that is not me. But this is Ed Dimmock, who presented at the AECB conference last year. It's the biggest AECB certified project that we have so far. It's 91 flats. And what's interesting about it is that it started off life as a failed retrofit. So the tower block was clad, it went badly, pieces of the insulation started falling off on people. So the whole building needed to be shut down, stripped, and started again. But now they've turned these 91 flats into very low energy, comfortable homes for people. And I'm not sure when it's due to be complete, but it's soon. On the other end of the scale, and this is probably the smallest project that you'll see today, and I think it might be one of the smallest certified AECB carbon light retrofit projects. It's one of ours, and just for clarity, it's much harder to do really small projects, just so you know. It's harder to do when they're an east-west detached bungalow. That's all of the criteria to make something really, really hard to meet the Passive House standards. So with this project, we did all of that, the process of the survey information, the conditions survey, modelled it in PHPP, found out that actually it's not achievable. We can't get it to be Passive House because it's just everything is working against it. So instead, we decided to target the AECB standards. It's just so beautiful. So here you can see that it just was never going to get to the NFIT standard. Part of that was that we had an integrated garage. It's a project for a person who's a triple amputee. So we had to have an integrated garage. And if you talk to any Passive House designer, they'll gasp at that. But it was just non-negotiable. So the target space heating demand ended up at 37. So that's quite a lot better than the AECB retrofit standard, but quite a lot worse than Passive House NFIT standard. And that was based on installing measures that were appropriate to the building. So we filled the cavities, we put on EWI, and it got to a certain level that felt like a kind of reasonable level to be aiming at. So that's how it compares to the base case, which is the building as existing. So it's, what is that, a 75% reduction already? So in terms of operational energy, it's doing great. And to do that, and I'm just going to whiz through these because I'm aware of time, I kind of hit on insulation and thermal bridge-free detailing. This is how that's achieved. So the kind of key areas that we were watching out for were the base of the wall, making sure that we went down past the DPC to make sure we mitigated that thermal bridge because we couldn't eliminate it. And then introducing insulation at the eaves to make sure we joined on to the wall insulation. That insulation around the windows then wraps the front of the windows to make sure that's one continuous blanket that just envelops the whole of the building. And the same with the air tightness there. So you can see the kind of practical application of some of that. We tried to use as low carbon materials as possible, but the client was quite keen to have an EPS insulation on the outside of the building. And again, so the air tightness, achieving a really low air tightness, you need to detail that in. So having one continuous red line for your air tightness that goes around your section and completely envelops the building is really, really important. And that's what that looks like. That's a a very well-wrapped building, to the point where it actually exceeded the expectations of the project teams who were aiming for below 2, and because the builder was just so enthusiastic about airtightness, we managed to get it down to below 0.6, which saved the client at the end of it another £200 per year on heating. So there's no... You don't have to aim for the very worst case in terms of each standard. There's always a benefit to going further, especially if it doesn't actually involve any additional material or work. So the additional savings meant that we were aiming for 37 kilowatt hours per metre square per year, which was an 82% reduction in terms of operational energy. And what you get at the end of it is this lovely certificate. And unlike the Passive House certificates, what you get is a summary of your air tightness, of your space heating demand, and of your summer comfort, so your overheating risk. So that actually gives a bit of value to the things that you've done extra. So we can say this is an ACB carbon light retrofit, but look at its score, it's even better. And that's some pictures. You can also make it a bit pretty, which is lovely. And that's it.
Do you want to join the panel discussion? So thank you very much to Hannah. Some really interesting examples there at various different scales of how we can apply standards. So can I ask our other panellists now to join Hannah on the stage? So Chris, if you'd like to join Hannah, and also two colleagues from the School of Natural and Built Environment here at Queen's, Dr Clare Mulholland and Dr Neil Galway. Clare is a senior lecturer in architecture in the School of Natural and Built Environment. As a chartered architect, Clare's research focuses on city planning, architectural design, intergroup contact in divided societies, spatial practices, socio-spatial integration, and community participation in the design process. Clare's teaching practice focuses on architecture, design, technology and environment, and the climate crisis in relation to design process and specification. Clare has worked in high-profile architectural practices in London and Belfast, where she's designed diverse projects across the commercial, educational and community sectors. Dr Neil Galway is a chartered urban planner with a PhD in planning focused on heritage reconstruction, memory and identity. He is the Director of MSc programmes in City Planning and Design and Planning and Development at Queen's, here in Belfast. Neil supervises PhD researchers on visual impairment and the built environment, green infrastructure and child-friendly planning. So thank you, Clare and Neil, for joining us today, and for Hannah and Chris for contributing to the discussion. So as with the panel discussion this morning, I have a number of questions that were received in the registration forms that I'll start with, but do get your thinking caps on and start thinking about what questions you would like to ask, because we've got plenty of time for questions from the floor as well. So starting first of all with Chris. Chris, what role can strengthened collaboration between the public and private sectors play in accelerating ecological enhancement within urban environments, and what mechanisms can be implemented to ensure long-term success?
That's a very good question. I think there's some real work to be done to join up the public and private sector. As I said earlier, we're one of the smallest markets in the green roof industry. If I compare us with Germany, they're installing around 8 million square metres of green roof every year. We're installing around 250,000 square metres, and that's a huge difference. And actually, a lot of that is to do with funding. So the German government, the water authorities, they recognise the value of green roofs and so put money towards that and fund it. Yet our governments don't really get behind it, and actually that really makes quite a difference. However, you know, green roofs are becoming more of an opportunity in the UK, more through choice rather than planning. And I think we need to continue that knowledge transfer and help shape policy to get this up the agenda to show it is a really good nature-based solution in the climate emergency.
Thank you. I did say to the panellists before we came on, if you want to chip in on any of the questions at all, so if anyone wants to sort of comment on biodiversity enhancement, now is a good opportunity to do that, but I suspect the audience will ask some questions too. No? Yeah, Hannah? No.
I don't think I could offer any additional.
Well, the next question is for you anyway. So, a question on the key factors that should influence any decision to pursue NRFIT or AEC retrofit standards, and how project teams can balance performance, cost, and technical feasibility when selecting the most appropriate pathway. So, any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah. So, I guess so. Basically, anything is technically possible. And it's all about working out what your building really lends itself to. So starting with a bit of an analysis of how the building currently performs. So whether it's north-south orientated, whether it's detached, whether it's a nice square cube, or if it's star-shaped, that's much more difficult. And getting to grips with the current performance. And then sort of going back to what I was saying in the presentation, PHPP modelling, just work it out. If it's, scientifically apply some numbers to it so that you know exactly what's achievable. And it may be that it's not achievable. It may be that the ACB retrofit standard is not achievable. But at least you'll know where you sit on that kind of line. That would be my approach.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So Claire, thank you for joining us today. So I have a question. Many of our attendees today have expressed interest in how we balance the necessary upgrades to enhance energy performance while maintaining the unique architectural and historical characteristics of many of our existing buildings. So there were lots of questions that we could have selected, but a particular one from Ryan Young from Deelup and Waller. He asks, how do we preserve the character of our existing buildings while designing for the low heating demands which enable sustainable energy systems to be feasible?
Okay, thank you, Ryan, wherever you are. So with reference to listed buildings and heritage buildings, so in the UK we've 10.2 million buildings that were built before 1944. In Northern Ireland we've just under 9,000 listed buildings. So we have a duty, as all the people in this room, to find ways that our more historic buildings can be adapted and reused continually, so they're always sort of viable. So there's always people living in them and they're always comfortable. Why preserve them? I suppose the three factors. The historical and cultural value of our listed buildings is obvious. Our built environment is a reflection of power and economics at that time, so it reflects the socio-economic character of our cities. It has craftsmanship and identity that we want to hand down. Secondly, the environmental benefits of keeping a building instead of demolishing it are very, very clear and very established and link into our ambitions of circular economy. And then third, in terms of retention, the economic benefits and place-making benefits of making sure the history of our cities are clear, are there. The tourist industry has sort of established many cities like that. So when we're approaching, I suppose, to change for an historic building, you could think of it as in, okay, firstly, we're the custodians, so we have to do no harm. We're guardians of these buildings for a short time, and then we hand them on. So you have to, unlike a new build, we can't look at it as a kind of blanket rules, as we do with new builds. It has to be on a case-by-case basis. Now, there's two things with that. The first thing is, that's fantastic. That means you get a tailored solution specifically for an historic building. Then the downside of that is it's really difficult to get benchmarking and comparative benchmarking then across the board. So the four steps you could consider, and I think this people are familiar with. The first one is we have to identify the merit and the heritage of the building and truly understand its design intent and why it was designed and how it sits as an object and why it was designed that way, but also how it sits and contributes to its context. So we have to understand why it's important, and that goes beyond reading the lovely report that's in the listed buildings that you get. It's the architecture and the design team understanding that, and then leading on from that, it's understanding the original design intent behind performance, so how the building was originally performing, how it was meant to be vented, how it was meant to be heated, how it was meant to be cooled. And what's interesting with the case studies we get, they're normally already adapted multiple times, so it's very rare you get one that's in its original state. You might get one that has like 5 different extensions and different boiler systems put in. So it is important before any decisions are made to unpack that, to see what's of merit and what's of use and what can be reused. And I think that's where early hydrothermal analysis would come in, through WIFI or through the Revit Green Studio, whichever means we need to undertake to understand how heat and moisture works in the existing structure before we do anything. So when we've completed those 2, we then we can make intelligent, accurate decisions, but it's interdisciplinary, and there'll always be a debate. There's always a debate, and and people will have different positions on it. All positions can be correct. And with all of the debate that happens, again, it's how do we preserve this to pass on, to the next generations beyond us. I think what's exciting, even in the past sort of 5 years, is the advances in technology in terms of software. So our modelling software moves on at an incredible rate, which is wonderful, and AI is now in the equation. And then the advances in our materials, so materials like, we're going to say insulated lime render, which if we put that on the inside, it claims that of a solid wall building, you can get up to 50% increase in sort of protection from heat loss. Companies like Indie Nature, which are the first hemp-based UK-based kind of company that produces hemp insulation at an industrial scale, and the hemp is grown in England, therefore it's less travel distance, therefore when we spec it, we can be ethically, we're doing the right thing. There's multiple new products coming out which are breathable, made from natural products, and that's exciting. We still have challenges. The VAT challenge is ongoing, so that has to be corrected. It has to be incentivized that we love and protect our existing building stock. There is a challenge in terms of the rating, how we actually judge our older buildings, and English Heritage raise all the time. The EPC rating is flawed. It doesn't really work for older building stock. You can apply for it not to be counted on your building, but that's not useful either. So we need an energy rating that is suitable for our historical building stock. And then I would say there's always the fee issue, and this is for all design teams, that older buildings take a long time to unpack. You're going to find things on site that no one discovered, and whenever the fees of the industry are getting squeezed, smaller and smaller, it's really hard to have time to make designed, slower decisions. One last point to be optimistic. I would say probably anyone in the room 20 years ago going through design school, it was all focused on new build. Certainly when I was there, it was all new build project, new build project, new build project in design studio. And then in the past 7 years, that's changed among our students and how we educate our students. And they now come through with always having an adaptive reuse project where they're looking at envelope and structure and fabric. So that's the last bit of optimism in terms of there might have been a skill gap, but we're trying to contribute towards closing that, I think.
Thank you, Claire. Lots of food for thought there about the challenges for us, but also the opportunities for reuse of our historic buildings. So Neil, as a final opening question, for you, a question that came up from the registration was, as construction projects are predominantly certified within defined red line boundaries, what opportunities exist for design and construction teams to positively influence biodiversity enhancement, green infrastructure integration, and the overall improvement of the urban environment?
Nice short question. Thanks.
Yeah, catchy one.
In some ways, well, the world doesn't start or finish at a red line. And some of that can be thinking about how the building itself relates to the world around it, thinking about where the opportunities exist to look at the projects that Chris spoke about just after the lunch break as well. Going back to his question, not that I'm trying to answer a different question, about the relationship between the public and the private. Sometimes it's looking at where the policy exists or where the public sector can encourage, through incentives, development or proposals that would encourage things like green roofs and looking at how they can work together to actually look at the enhancement of biodiversity. At the moment, the policy that's in plans in Belfast talks about considering things like green roofs or green walls where possible. I don't think there's necessarily that particular guidance. Here we don't have legislation like Biodiversity Net Gain, which is probably helping to drive some of the green roof projects, across the water. Has been criticism of how that works in some quarters as well, but there's a certainty, I guess. If you're looking at a 10% gain for an urban project, maybe it's looking at, essentially taking it a step back, realizing that the scale that I work on is larger generally than the building scale, looking at, okay, well, how does this building actually relate to the broader neighbourhood? How can we actually make improvements in the neighbourhood? That could be through, things like sort of developer contributions, through planning, through looking at, the uses of the surrounding area, the quality of spaces, how this becomes a place that people would want to live as well. Could be the internal decisions, looking at if we're trying to encourage more sustainable development patterns, how we can provide the facilities within reworked buildings that provide for active travel, encouraging or active frontage, having an appropriate mix of facilities. Clare touched upon a really important issue, about how many of the historic buildings that we'd be working with and some of our students would do projects and planning in relation to this are buildings that are functionally obsolete. The amount of empty churches that we have, across Ireland generally, I would suggest, former sort of industrial buildings, how we can try to, repurpose buildings that, ideally, it's great to keep all of this heritage, but how do we do something that actually works for society nowadays? How do we ensure that there is a broader social benefit, especially in areas where there are issues of rural isolation? Some of our students in recent times have done a lot of work with the sort of Village Catalyst program as an exercise, going, okay, well, what do we do with these buildings that are, maybe 2 generations away from the function that they were created for? How can we do something to provide childcare, training, working facilities in neighbourhoods or rural areas where there are these broad issues as well? I don't think I answered the question, Siobhan.
What a creep, but definitely you did answer the question. So we have an opportunity now to take some questions from the floor. So I would ask you to raise your hand like you did earlier, and we will get a microphone to you. Do please, before you ask your question, let us know what your name is and what organisation you're from, please. Okay, so any questions? Oh, I think we have one there in the middle.
Hi, my name's Andrew Abraham. I'm an architect and passive house designer with HLM. My question is directed towards you, Hannah. Thanks for your presentation. And it is really in the context of the Paris Agreement and the decarbonising grid. Do you think that there's a tipping point between achieving operational energy standards at the cost of whole life carbon? So using like XPS to achieve operational performance versus the cost that is with whole life? That was a bit of a mouthful. I hope it makes sense.
No.
No, in that it doesn't make sense, or that you don't believe there's a tipping point?
I don't think it's an either or. I think that it's very possible to build to the passive house standard, for example, and fully take into account embodied carbon, and for those two things to work together. And it's once you've minimised your space heating demand and your operational carbon that embodied carbon becomes so significant. So I don't think the two things are kind of it's not a juxtaposition. It's a means to an end, if you see what I mean. So no.
Do any of the other panellists want to comment on that, or any thoughts on that?
I thought no, because I didn't understand. Token planner on the panel.
was a very interesting conversation to begin. Any other questions from the floor? It's been a great day of input, and I've reached a point where I'm struggling to think of things. Yeah, Nathan. It's coming to you.
I guess it's probably for Chris, and it's to help me in my own role. I should say Nathan Campbell, Queen's Estates. Thank you. So BNG across the water, and you've obviously been working with that legislation, and you've seen the impacts of that. And I guess from the Northern Irish perspective, is there anything practically we can do to be ready for that coming in the future? Is there, you know, could we prepare for that in any way? Is there anything practically that we could do? We're obviously looking to enhance biodiversity on our existing buildings and our new buildings alike. And the second part of that question, totally unrelated, was if, for example, we've got John here doing the structural design for our condition survey and the structural assessment of an existing building, would that, you'd sort of mentioned it being taken into account whenever you're putting a green roof on a building. Has there ever been sort of an issue where you have to maybe enhance the structure of that roof slab or something like that? And is there maybe a tipping point in carbon terms where you're not getting the benefit anymore?
Half the question, Chris, if you want.
Yeah, sure. I guess if I go back to Milton Keynes, it's quite a good example for us, but lots of buildings there, this is post-pandemic, pre-pandemic they were office blocks, now there's the need for housing, so a lot of the office blocks in central Milton Keynes are now being converted to accommodation. But in that city centre, where's the green space going to be for all those residents living in the building? So what we're seeing is a lot of the roof spaces are actually, there's been an increase to the amount of levels of the building, so an additional 2 or 3 levels are going on top of the existing structure. So it's at that point where we need to be working with the structural engineers to say, look, you're putting an extra 2 layers or 2 levels on top of the building. This is what we need to create green space for the people living in the building. Where can they access safely? Where have they got to, you know, to grow their own fruit and vegetables, to have access to green space? We need to join those 2 up, and I think that often gets missed. And we're seeing that now that, you know, BNG in the UK often looks at new build developments rather than existing stock and projects that are being retrofitted. So it would be good to see a bit more join up there, I think. In terms of BNG across the water, yes, it came in April last year, but practically we haven't installed any BNG projects yet because they're probably a year or 2 years down the line before they'll be ready to put a green roof on. And I think there's also challenges there because they have to be monitored and can be inspected for the first 5 years and monitored for up to 30 years. But who are the people doing that? And that hasn't been defined yet. And even our industry don't know who the people are that are going to be inspecting that. So there's a lot of work still to do on BNG. What's really good is that when I look in trade press, all I see now is planning applications in cities across the UK, and pretty much they all include green roofs. Now that's a huge change to 2 years ago, to 5 years ago. But I think the exciting opportunities for us all here in this room is retrofitting the existing stock and doing really good stuff with that, because that just gets missed. And we're in a crisis. You know, everyone keeps saying crisis, emergency. Well, what are you doing? We can't wait for these buildings to be built in 3 years' time. We need to look at what we've got now and bring those green spaces in. And we can 100% do that. We just need to look at how that's funded and bring everyone on board to get there.
Thank you. Hannah?
We have a project on site at the moment, not on site, sorry, in planning at the moment, where we're having to deal with the BNG side of things. And for complete clarity, I support the BNG side of things. I think it's really important. But what we're finding is that firstly, it's really difficult to find BNG credits. It's surprisingly difficult to get the 10% uplift. So we're finding that even with a project where the whole site is tarmac and concrete, we're turning it into housing and green space, but we're down by 0.76 of a unit. So we're having to buy a unit. It's really hard to find companies who have the local sites that are managed, that have a 30-year management program. We found one organisation that can actually sell us credits. It's costing between £30,000 and £46,000 for 0.76 of credit. And I have real concerns that, in a situation where we didn't think we'd have a problem on the site because it's so barren, that actually is going to cause a wider problem in terms of build quality. So we've already got this kind of squeeze on build quality. People already don't think they can build net zero carbon or passive house. So it's another thing that's coming out of that budget without any support, I guess.
This links into your field more as well in terms of healthy cities. So, Chris, I really enjoyed your presentation. And I don't know if you chose the Education Authority building by accident or if you'd strategically planned it, but it was really smart. So I just think in the context of Belfast, it's fascinating, especially in the inner city core, where we have ambitions, and the council has ambitions to grow the population massively because not many people live there. And within the inner city core, for multiple reasons and historic reasons, there's not that many green spaces. So if you were to go to the park, or if we were to live there with our children, sorry, we have families separate, not together, but if we were to live there,
It's news to me.
surprise, then it would be, you would have to go to City Hall for a tiny bit of green space. So using the roofscapes would be absolutely amazing. And what's exciting about Belfast as well is that a lot of the buildings are owned by Department of Communities or public sector buildings, where there was that opportunity if policy and budget were in place. And then it would be quite exciting is how that, because we're talking about the horizontal plane up here, how then that connects to our horizontal plane down here about sort of active travel and green routes and green corridors through the city. So I got quite excited. So I'd love you to do like a whole greenscape of the city centre. Would be brilliant.
On that, I think there is a real opportunity there because we have a lot, even some of it's the edge of the city centre as well, Claire, where you've got this sort of a missing city map was done about 10 years ago in Belfast of all of these industrial sites that haven't been developed, and maybe some of it is looking at temporary uses of spaces. Longer term, ideally, these will be houses for people to live in. There'll be employment spaces, but looking at sort of temporary greening. And sometimes whenever you look at the even baseline indicators of biodiversity, so things like our Sirocco, Belfast waterfront, our urban mosaic habitats now, so they're evolving into these green spaces almost organically. But I think there is something that the system can do to try to green what is a very hard city, and sometimes it's even looking at the broad issues we have in relation to our archaic Victorian sort of water infrastructure and how we can maybe plumb with plants slightly more through developments. I think the only sort of major green roof in the city centre is probably on Victoria Square, which isn't publicly accessible and is sedum as well. In other parts of the world where there are green roofs, there is an expectation that there's some form of public access as well, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. London, if you're putting green spaces, roof gardens on in central London, in the City of London, they have to be free and accessible to residents and people to go and visit. So you may have to book a ticket, but it's free. And I think we were talking about that last night, Sarah saying, looking down from the Sky Garden, it shocked you how many green roofs there were, but it's only when you get up to that height that you suddenly realise how much is actually going on. And that's, yeah, I think, and going back to Nathan's point as well, I think actually the success in London is the urban greening factor, and actually you can do that standalone. And what we're finding now is, as we get more metro mayors across the UK, they want to better that urban greening factor, they want to better the London plan, and there's nothing stopping you drawing the line in the sand and saying this is what we're going to do and this is what we want to work towards. And I think, you have done that as well as a university. You've already said, look, we don't just want basic green roofs, we want good quality green roofs. And that, no doubt you would have got resistance, but you've got to continue pushing and letting the developers and people know exactly what you want and not taking second best.
Just on that, in London there's National Park City, the world's first as well. A large part of that is even maybe, I think, a community up measure, but a political drive to go, how can we make places greener? How can we ensure that young people are outside more? I say that because colleagues at Wild Belfast are trying to do something similar with Belfast as well, looking at how Belfast could be a national park city.
Fascinating reflections there, and really interesting. And I think especially that idea of retrofitting existing green roofs and perhaps some of the public buildings here in Belfast, taking a lead on it, and then when we do have a residential community in the city centre, perhaps those being accessible is really interesting. I also, just to add to the conversation, I'm very conscious as someone who works in materials that actually 95% of biodiversity impacts of new construction happen off-site. So they're not happening on the site where things are being constructed. They're due to the extraction of the concrete or the rocks or the steel. And I think the advantage of retrofit is we're automatically ensuring that that doesn't happen. So if we're retrofitting and enhancing a site by putting a green roof or some other biodiversity measure on it, that is so much better than a brand new build in many, many ways. Okay.
Offset her or create that credit very locally to that project in that town or city on a rooftop that exists?
Yeah, that would be fabulous. It's. I mean, I guess maybe that's the learning is to get the sites ready to be developed to have the biodiversity net gains installed on them.
Very nice link back to Nathan's original question, so very well done. Okay, any other questions from the floor? We've talked about biodiversity. Anything further on biodiversity that people would like to understand more about? Yep, Gavin.
It's not directly related to biodiversity, but I'm curious to hear from each of the panel members around, we've talked about legislation mandating change, and you've talked about standards, and how do each of you think legislation and policy plays a factor in this? Because in the example of the historic buildings, you want an individual approach, but how does standards and policy and targets factor in, and does it help or hurt, as in what we ultimately hope to achieve?
I think there is, I don't think policy is always rigorous enough I think the want and the desire is there, but actually what's the price if you don't do that? And I think that there is a disconnect there. I think we do need to help and encourage to influence policy to actually bring up the standards. And I still don't think there's enough learning or understanding of what green roofs do or what they can do. So there is still a lot of work to be done there with policy, but actually we need data behind that. We need to, I reeled off earlier, there's lots of benefits to green roofs, but we need good UK data. And that's something that's now happening with universities, and the Open University are leading a project on actually developing that over 2 years. But that's going to take time, and actually I think we do need to work closer together, and the industry needs to work more on knowledge transfer to get this up the agenda.
If I'm talking more about maybe the biodiversity angle, because I think whenever you're talking about historic buildings, there needs to be that sort of flexibility, built in. There needs to be a sort of a strive towards targets for new build, and it's critical. But there needs to be a flexibility for older buildings. But I suppose it's the credibility of policy and legislation as well. I was this morning with students down in the transport hub, looking at the difficulty of planning conditions in relation to, TransLink cards for 3 years, and or reports done by Sheffield University about the fact that most biodiversity conditions, aren't complied with, or these, features that are desired, aren't actually developed and implemented whenever it comes to the final building. So I think it's thinking about, if there are these broad drives, to enhance biodiversity, to encourage reuse, looking at how there can be incentives or ways of making it easier. No doubt Clare and others will have touched upon things like VAT being something that's been rattling about for several generations as an obvious issue as well.
Policy and legislation. So, well, I can speak for Northern Ireland. We're really, really good at doing guidance documents, really good. Loads of them, loads of guidance documents, loads of ambition, and it's brilliant. And it doesn't always translate to policy, because policy takes such a long time to come to fruition. So there's always a gap between what we want to do and then the mechanisms we have to kind of make it happen. So there's that gap there. And I think that gap is really applicable for new builds in terms of we have to have those standards where they should be. And certainly our building control is still, catching up with that. We need the legislation in place sometimes to convince clients that it's important. And as much as architects are really good salespeople, we can't, you can't sell everything, and you need to say this is what ambition is. So there's that. With the historic buildings, I think it'd be really useful to get, I'm going to say benchmarking, because it does have to have flexibility on a case-by-case basis. So instead of the blanket rules of a new wall must be this, I think a benchmarking where a study over time that gathers that data, it's there, it's maybe just not pulled together, and then that they have their own energy rating would be incredibly useful. I think anyone I've ever worked with in the historic division are incredibly intelligent, and I trust them wholly to kind of guide the buildings and forward for the next generation.
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? So I believe in legislation. If I was ruler of the world, I would make all new builds passive house, all of them. And for retrofits, I think that even with historic buildings, I think that more is achievable than maybe we think. So there'll obviously be cases where you just can't touch anything. But there are also loads of ways of upgrading even listed buildings to be, we're working on a listed NFIT project. We're working on retrofits of locally listed buildings. So there are situations where, and obviously, like you say, case-by-case basis, but there are situations where you can push the envelope and really take the building as far as it wants to be taken. So I would suggest that actually the ACB carbon light retrofit standard as a base level to be aiming for, potentially, then reviewing things on the context of the building itself and the heritage value of specific heritage assets. But as an approach, I think it's the way to go.
No, I agree, and I think for the older building stock, considering the spectrum of things we can do, so you end up having a cocktail of measures that you can put in place to really, really improve the fabric, and it might be from the low tech of draft proofing, and actually for the windows and the floors, and still allowing vent, and then to the higher tech where you're thinking of the energy systems to heat the building. So having that spectrum, actually you can achieve a lot under that umbrella.
Okay, any more questions from the floor? Yes? Oh, there's one in the second row there. Yeah. And then another in the front after that.
Scott Farrer from Scott Brownrigg Architects. We've just mentioned VAT being a barrier to retrofit. Do you know if there's any ongoing lobbying to local government to reverse that, essentially? And if not, what can we do as an industry to make that happen?
There's zero VAT on energy saving products, but that doesn't cover the retrofit project as a whole, as we know. And then it's like, well, why would people then choose retrofit? It's going to cost us more. It's going to take us more time. You're going to get more problems. It's a headache, as much as we romanticize it and it's beautiful and it's wonderful to work on. There is lobbying going on, and I know MAG are kind of involved with that as well. And the lobbying has been going on for so long now that it's time to up a scale. And I actually think our is Kieran Fox here? Our institution representatives.
Cycling past earlier.
He's probably cycling past a way to fix the VAT issue. But I think our professional bodies need to step in. I actually think there's a lot of power behind with the people who deliver the buildings, the contractors and our major contractors. So there could be more. But the problem is I've been hearing this for a long time, that the conversations are happening. But if someone else in the room has an update, that would be great.
Craig, it's behind you.
Hi, thanks. I just want to follow up on Gavin's question about legislation. Claire, you mentioned the kind of scale of the problem, the kind of millions of houses, and the scale of the opportunity that people don't necessarily know that is there to upgrade our buildings. And Hannah, you showed us a beautiful but very disruptive retrofit of a building. So I wondered if you both could talk around the kind of political viability of retrofitting our housing stock at the scale required versus the kind of disruption that will cause to the population at large.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the questions. You go
So that was a very disruptive project. It was the entire fabric, including the floor and the roof and the walls and everything. We are the carbon carp project that we're working on. It's aiming for 50 kilowatt hours per metre square per year, which is the ACB standard. It's not a certified project, but that's another conversation. But that's being done whilst people are still living there, and it's what's really exciting about that project is that it's taken people on the journey with it. So there's been really extensive consultation that's been done already by Carbon Co-op and by People Powered Retrofit in Manchester to bring people into the process of retrofitting, taking them on the journey, allowing them things like colour choice in terms of their windows and their render, or whilst they're still living there. So it's definitely possible. And then part of that programme is that we're doing all the things externally that are difficult for people to do, and then we're providing extra details for people to try and kind of finish the project, if you like. So we're providing floor details for people to do a bit of DIY at the end of the project. So it definitely, that you can still get to a very good standard of retrofit whilst people are in there. And there's also some really interesting products that are coming out at the moment. So there's the aero barrier air tightness product that you can kind of, it takes maybe half a day to make a building very, very, very airtight without any kind of disruption. So I think there are loads of options to do that. It just requires an extra level of engagement that maybe isn't ordinarily there through particularly social housing projects, but it's possible.
I think there's a really interesting point around education and wider education and knowledge on our built environment. And I think in the UK and Ireland, we end up talking about the built environment once we're already in university, but there's very little conversation about the importance of design, the space you inhabit, the space you occupy through other stages of education like primary and secondary. So there's very little knowledge there about the impact that has on your well-being. Like we spend 80 to 90% of our lives indoors, yet our children, we don't have conversations with them about what that means and what this environment means and what construction means in our built environment. So there's an education piece on a wider level, and then the education piece that you were just talking about, which is about bringing people along with you, is incredibly important. And I think then after that, the post-occupancy bit where it's finished, I think it's important that there's always a return to it and a systematic return to make sure the residents are still comfortable and happy and knowledgeable that we did this, therefore now that's why you feel this, that, you know, and that's continued, because I think doing it like, I'm going to say one-off experiment and leaving can then have When I say it can lead to some negative experiences from the people inside the house, then they spill that on to someone else. In terms of decant and trying to do the work when people are in the house, as someone living through a renovation at the minute, it's very traumatic. And I suppose that I would lean into the people from the housing executive who probably are very knowledgeable on how to manage this. I don't know if they're still in the room, about how that decant works, but I wouldn't really know beyond that.
To try and answer that. Okay. A follow-on from me, and I suppose it really comes from that question of the balance. So obviously we would love to get to passive house or carbon light if possible in every retrofit, and we don't want to do something that's going to preclude us from doing something at a later date that would perhaps get us closer to those standards. But how do we work with homeowners to kind of allow people to understand what the best pathway for retrofit for their homes is, and to prevent things happening that then make life much more difficult in the future?
Can I answer that? Is that okay?
You look like you want to.
I think that's a great question, and we haven't really touched on phasing very much today, but it's key, because what we don't want to do is encourage loads of people to retrofit, get them to spend the money that they have, which might be a significant amount, but not enough to do everything. And get people to do retrofit to a very light touch standard, which then locks them into a low performance of building that they can't upgrade later, or that will cost a lot of money and carbon to upgrade later. So phasing is a much better idea, but there are practical implications to that. So working out the best starting point, for example, which is ventilation. Just to be clear, it's ventilation, 100%. And then I think it comes back to this thing of the roadmap. So you give people a roadmap of what they need to get to ultimately, and along the way you'll have these step-by-step process, and there will be things that are just absolutely linked to one another unavoidably. So, for example, external wall insulation to windows, that's a very difficult thing to separate. Whereas your floor would be something that's completely sort of isolated. So getting a plan, a strategic plan, which could be something that is replicable. It could be that you're looking at something like an area-based scheme where you develop a set of archetypes, a detailed design that can be applied to all of those archetypes essentially, and then people need to just engage with that as opposed to starting the whole process on their own. I think it's a good way of doing it.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the floor? Another one? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Tara. Apologies, I didn't see you.
Thanks, Siobhan. I'm Tara Brooks. I'm a lecturer in construction management at Queen's, but I also have another hat. I am a Belfast City councillor and I sit on the planning committee. And I'm afraid this isn't really a retrofit, but Hannah, I don't disagree with you saying that you would like every new building to be passive house. But Belfast also has a housing crisis, as just so many areas in the UK. And there are some areas of opinion amongst some of the decision makers who say that we shouldn't hold up housing, that we should just build, and actually some people who think that any new housing is good. So can you help give me ammunition to support your case that actually it's worth that investment and maybe that extra time?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you start from the point of passive house being high quality housing, then what you're saying is you're dialing back from that. So how far are you going to dial back from high quality housing? What's the kind of level that you're prepared to get to? I think in terms of, the examples in, for example, Exeter, they've built tons of social housing to the passive house standard. They've eradicated fuel poverty. They have eradicated rental arrears. It's completely appropriate to have, I guess, social housing or affordable housing as passive house. It's the most, it brings the biggest benefit to the widest number of people. So why on earth would you not do it? I mean, I agree that there's a question of uplifting cost, but if we're talking about we're talking about an uplift of, say, I mean, if it was, I can't remember who said it was around 6%, but we're talking about maybe 6 to 11% in terms of the uplift to Passive House. That's the kind of cost that if you design something as a Passive House from the beginning, you can save elsewhere, you can. And you just need to focus the budget on the things that matter from my point of view.
Really interesting questions. I have one final question that I would like to ask each of the panellists to give me a short 1 or 2 line answer on, and then I think we'll close proceedings for today. So I want you to just pause for a moment and imagine the future, 2050, say, as a time frame. And I want you to think about what the built environment might look like and what the construction industry might look like. So it is a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but just to give us a flavour of what you think the challenges will be, and what, obviously we would love it to be a utopia, but what do you think the built environment might be, and how might we be engaging in it in a different way? I don't know who would like to start with that one. It's a tricky one, and I didn't brief the panel on this. It's a bit unkind of me.
Someone look at me. So what was the date we're aiming for?
Sorry?
What was the date?
The date about 2050, so far enough that we are on this journey. So it's not going to be universal, but what will our thinking be that might be different from now? Or will we have reached that nirvana where people are living in healthy homes that are well insulated?
I mean, there's what you hope will happen, and there's what you think will happen, which are maybe...
let's go for what we hope will happen then.
I mean, the way that I'm going to choose to answer that is that I think there's a huge opportunity at this point in time where we have this... we're at the point where we know how to do it. We do have a huge... this room is full of people who have an immense knowledge and experience in how to deliver that. So we are at the point where it could go either way, but it really needs leadership, right? It needs, right at the very top, we need to be committing more to low energy building. Yeah, I think that's what I think.
Perfect, thank you.
I agree. Well, speaking of it could go either way, it could go really badly. We know that, and we know especially in Belfast, the flood risks and the storms that we get and everything like that. So we know what way it could go. I'm given great optimism by our young people and the people we teach in planning and engineering and architecture that they are angry, that they are quite radical in their thinking. They're right, and they're quite angry at us for not looking after the environment better, rightly so, and they're very engaged in their education and engaged in how do we change. So that gives me optimism for, I'm going to say, resilience, and that's what our environment should be, is resilient. And then I'm optimistic for the green utopia, like the Singapore 2030 green plan. Having that here would be fantastic. So that's the hope, the dream.
I appreciate the optimism, Claire, because whenever I initially got that question, I was extrapolating some of the trends we have in Belfast, which is towards continued, but I'll not go there.
This is like a staff meeting, sorry.
No, but I think there's a really important point that the students that Claire and I and others in the room are teaching now don't maybe have that expectation of maybe generations before, which is, the aspiration to the house in the countryside, or suburbia, or 2-3 cars. I think it's maybe trying to look at how we can try to make the city a livable place, but also how we can look at housing policy slightly differently and try to look at viable alternatives for us to bring our children to live in a city centre, because at the moment broad challenges we have would be that city centre isn't seen as an aspirational space. It's a space where we've had shed loads of student accommodation constructed, and by and large a city centre that is severed by our sectarian geographies and social housing need. Trying to go, how can we actually make it a place where you have quality spaces where you have opportunities, for young people, regardless of where they're from, where there's quality play spaces, green spaces, and there is that sort of city centre that people would want to live in. And I think that's as close to utopia as we're going to get.
I think we need to, rather than force green spaces upon people, make them part of the design into that, because ultimately it's their space that they're going to inhabit. And actually, can we turn it on its head a bit? Can we actually design the building around the green space rather than the green space around the building, and look at it a different way? In a construction industry point of view, I hope that by 2050 it's a more welcoming industry. I wish that it's not going to be such a difficult environment to work in, and people are actually respected. And I think possibly the skill shortage and lack of people coming into the industry is because of how hard it really is. And actually, we're all human beings. We want good things. We want these to be our jobs, not to rule our lives. And I think there's some work to be done on that, definitely.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panellists for your contributions today. It's been a really useful and interesting conversation, and one that I hope we will continue in this room for some time to come. So I'm going to ask Sarah Lynch, Head of Sustainability here at Queen's, to come up and close the conference.
I hope that you've all enjoyed today's conference. I hope that you'll leave reinvigorated to continue the drive to get to net zero and the changes that we need around that. Please take some time to give us some feedback about this event. There should be, and there is, a QR code on our screen. We've really been encouraged by the interest, the numbers that we've had both coming along, and even the waiting list and the questions that have all come in around this event, and we want to really keep that momentum up. So please do get in touch with myself or through our wider sustainability team. If there's other things that you think we can support, or kind of reach out around a wider network across the coming year. There seems to be a lot of energy and a need for these discussions, and we want to see how we can really build on those conversations. I just want to close now by thanking each of you for attending today and for your contributions as well, that have really helped to shape the discussions during our panel sessions. Just want to extend my thanks to our speakers, to your panel guests. The event really would not have been possible without the collaboration of a number of valued partners, Belfast City Council, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, BEST, AHMM, CORA, Bridgman and Bridgman, Progress and Practice, and our esteemed colleagues from Natural Built Environment, and in particular Siobhan Cox for her excellent facilitation of today's event and conversations. Thanks to your audio team at the back there, moonlighting, the amazing staff that we have here at Riddel Hall, and a special thanks to our sustainability team who have really pulled this together, in particular Nathan Campbell, who's really put a lot of effort and commitment from shaping the programme to making sure that we all have had something to eat today, which is obviously really important when it comes to these sessions. So a special thank you to all of the team, and in particular Nathan. We've been trying to make this event as sustainable as possible, so you're all wearing a lovely lanyard today. If you could leave that on your chair or at the door before you leave, it'll enable us to recycle the cardboard bit and reuse the lanyard in the future. So please enjoy the rest of the time that I hope we have given you back today that you mightn't have been expecting. Enjoy some of the sunshine while it's still there, and have a safe journey home. Thank you.